Lieutenant Colonel James MacLeod of the 2nd Battalion Gordon Highlanders first glimpsed the rising sun flag through his field glasses at 0630 hours on February 15, 1942, as Japanese infantry of the Imperial Guards Division advanced down Orchard Road toward the heart of Singapore City. The crimson disc on white fabric hung limp in the humid morning air above the lead Type 97 Chiha medium tank, but its presence on the island that Winston Churchill had called the Gibraltar of the East represented the most catastrophic military defeat in British Imperial history. 7 days earlier, MacLeod had been positioned along the Jurong Line on Singapore's western coast, confident that the island fortress could withstand any assault the Japanese 25th Army might attempt. The concrete gun emplacements of Fort Siloso and Fort Canning mounted 15-inch naval rifles that could hurl 1,938-pound shells 23 miles across the Straits of Johor. The underground ammunition magazines held enough high-explosive shells to sustain bombardment for months. The Royal Air Force maintained 3 operational airfields at Sembawang, Tengah, and Kallang, with squadrons of Brewster Buffalo fighters and Bristol Blenheim bombers ready to repel any amphibious assault. But the massive coastal guns were positioned to defend against naval attack from the south, their concrete casements designed to protect against bombardment from the sea. The 15-inch rifles could not depress low enough to engage targets on the mainland of Malaya, barely 800 yards across the narrow straits that separated Singapore Island from the Johor Peninsula. General Arthur Percival's strategy assumed that any Japanese assault would come from the ocean, following the historical pattern of naval sieges that had shaped fortress design for 3 centuries. Lieutenant General Tomoyuki Yamashita had studied the Singapore defenses for 18 months before launching Operation E, the conquest of Malaya and Singapore. His intelligence officers had identified the critical weakness that British planners had overlooked. The fortress's northern shore, facing the Johor Peninsula, was defended by nothing more than barbed wire, machine gun nests, and the confidence of men who believed that 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops could not be defeated by an enemy they considered racially inferior. The Japanese 25th Army that had swept down the Malayan Peninsula in 55 days comprised just 3 divisions, the Imperial Guards Division, the 5th Division, and the 18th Division, supported by the 3rd Tank Group and elements of the 3rd Air Division. Total Japanese strength committed to the Malayan campaign numbered 65,000 men, 20,000 fewer than the defenders of Singapore. But Yamashita's forces possessed advantages that no amount of concrete fortification could offset: air superiority, tactical mobility, and the psychological momentum of an army that had not known defeat since the campaign began. MacLeod had watched the Japanese air attacks intensify throughout January 1942 as Mitsubishi A6M0 fighters and Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa fighters swept the skies clear of RAF resistance. The Brewster Buffalo, designed as a carrier fighter for the U.S. Navy and rejected as obsolete, proved hopelessly outclassed by Japanese aircraft that could outclimb, outturn, and outgun anything the RAF could put into the air. By February 8, when the Japanese assault on Singapore Island began, the RAF could muster fewer than 20 operational aircraft from the hundreds that had defended Malaya 6 weeks earlier. The sound that would haunt MacLeod for the rest of his life began at 2000 hours on February 8, 1942, the distinctive whine of Japanese 105mm howitzers firing across the Straits of Johor. The artillery barrage that preceded the amphibious assault concentrated on a 3-mile front along Singapore's northwestern coast, where the 22nd Australian Brigade held positions along the Sembawang Beach and Kranji River. For 4 hours, Japanese guns of the 5th Field Artillery Regiment and 18th Field Artillery Regiment pounded the Australian defensive positions with high-explosive shells and white phosphorus rounds that turned the mangrove swamps into an inferno. Colonel Bosley Gingel's 22nd Australian Brigade had been reduced to half-strength during the retreat down the Malayan Peninsula, and the surviving infantry companies of the 219th Battalion and 229th Battalion were spread across a front that should have been defended by a full division. The Australian positions consisted of hastily dug trenches and machine gun nests sited to cover the narrow beaches where landing craft might approach. But the Japanese assault came not from the expected direction of broad sandy beaches, but through the tidal creeks and mangrove channels that the defenders had considered impassable. At 0100 hours on February 9th, reconnaissance units of the Japanese Imperial Guards Division crossed the Straits of Johor in rubber boats and collapsible kayaks, navigating the maze of mangrove roots and tidal channels in complete darkness. The lead assault companies carried Type 11 light machine guns and Type 89 grenade launchers, weapons specifically chosen for their portability in amphibious operations. Behind them, engineers of the 25th Army's bridge-building units began assembling pontoon bridges to carry the main assault forces' Type 95 Hago light tanks and Type 97 Chiha medium tanks across the 800-yard water barrier. The first indication that MacLeod received of the Japanese breakthrough came at 0330 hours, when wireless communications from the 22nd Australian Brigade ceased abruptly. The silence that replaced the steady stream of position reports and ammunition requests was more ominous than any enemy bombardment. Within 6 hours, advance elements of the Imperial Guards Division had penetrated 5 miles inland and were approaching Tengah Airfield, one of Singapore's 3 remaining operational air bases. The speed of the Japanese advance shattered the carefully prepared defensive plans that General Percival had developed over 18 months of preparation. The Jurong Line, a series of concrete bunkers and anti-tank obstacles stretching across Singapore's western peninsula, was designed to channel any attacking force into predetermined killing zones where concentrated artillery fire and machine gun crossfire would destroy the assault before it could gain momentum. But the Japanese 25th Army did not advance in the methodical frontal assault that British military doctrine expected from Asian opponents. Instead, Lieutenant General Yamashita employed the same infiltration tactics that had broken British resistance throughout the Malayan campaign. Small units of Japanese infantry, carrying only essential weapons and ammunition, moved through the rubber plantations and secondary jungle that covered much of Singapore Island. They avoided the prepared defensive positions and struck instead at command posts, communication centers, and supply depots in the British rear areas. The Type 89 grenade launcher, with its 50mm mortar rounds, proved devastating against the concrete bunkers of the Jurong Line when fired from ranges of less than 200 yards. By noon on February 9th, the defensive line that had taken 6 months to construct was compromised in 17 different locations. The 1st Battalion Malaya Regiment, composed of locally recruited troops who had never faced combat, abandoned their positions after the first Japanese probing attacks reached their wire obstacles. The 44th Indian Brigade, already reduced to 1/3 strength by casualties suffered in Johor, could not cover the gaps left by the Malayan withdrawal. General Percival ordered a general withdrawal to the final defensive perimeter around Singapore City itself. MacLeod's Gordon Highlanders were assigned to defend the Alexandra Hospital area, a complex of medical buildings that housed over 700 wounded soldiers from the Malayan campaign. The hospital was clearly marked with Red Cross symbols and should have been protected under the Geneva Convention, but MacLeod had studied Japanese tactics during their campaigns in China and knew that the Imperial Japanese Army recognized no distinction between combatants and non-combatants when military necessity was involved. The withdrawal from the Jurong Line became a rout when Japanese aircraft of the 3rd Air Division began strafing the crowded roads leading into Singapore City. Nakajima Ki 27 Nate fighters, each mounting 277mm machine guns, flew continuous sorties against British transport columns that had nowhere to seek cover on the exposed causeways between the island's built-up areas. The Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers of the 60th Sentai and 98th Sentai dropped 250-kilogram bombs on the Keppel Harbor docks, destroying fuel storage tanks and ammunition dumps that the British had not had time to properly disperse. But the most devastating aspect of the Japanese air campaign was its psychological impact on troops who had been retreating for 6 weeks without effective air cover. The sound of aircraft engines approaching from the north sent entire battalions diving for cover in roadside ditches, breaking unit cohesion and allowing Japanese ground forces to advance with minimal resistance. The myth of European military superiority, which had sustained British colonial rule for 2 centuries, disintegrated under the weight of tactical reality. The defending forces available to General Percival on February 10th represented the largest concentration of British Imperial troops ever assembled in Southeast Asia, but their combat effectiveness had been systematically eroded by the relentless Japanese advance down the Malayan Peninsula. The 18th British Division, which had arrived in Singapore just 3 weeks earlier, consisted of battalions recruited from England's industrial cities, men who had trained for warfare in European conditions and found themselves fighting in tropical jungle against an enemy whose tactics bore no resemblance to German or Italian military doctrine. The Australian Imperial Force units that had fought the length of the Malayan Peninsula retained their organizational structure and fighting spirit, but ammunition shortages and the absence of effective artillery support reduced their defensive capabilities to little more than small arms resistance. The 219th Battalion had lost 40% of its strength during the fighting in Johor, and the surviving companies were equipped with World War I vintage Lee Enfield rifles and Bren light machine guns that required constant maintenance in the humid tropical climate. The Indian Army formations under British command faced the additional challenge of maintaining unit cohesion when many of their officers had been killed or wounded during the retreat from the Thai border. The 11th Indian Division, which had borne the brunt of the Japanese assault at Jitra and Kampar, could muster fewer than 3,000 effective infantry from an original strength of 15,000 men. The Gurkha battalions maintained their reputation for ferocious close-quarters combat, but even Gurkha kukris and bayonets could not compensate for the absence of air support and heavy weapons. MacLeod's assessment of the tactical situation on February 11th was grimly realistic. The Japanese 25th Army had achieved what German blitzkrieg tactics had accomplished in Poland and France: the complete disruption of enemy command and control through rapid penetration and encirclement. The difference was that Yamashita's forces had achieved this result with one-third the numerical strength of their opponents, operating at the end of supply lines that stretched 800 miles from their bases in Thailand. The key to Japanese success lay in their mastery of combined arms warfare adapted to tropical conditions. The Type 95 Hago light tanks that spearheaded Japanese advances through the rubber plantations weighed only 74 tons and could navigate terrain that British planners had considered impassable to armored vehicles. Their 37mm guns were ineffective against modern tanks, but devastating against the concrete bunkers and machine gun nests that formed the backbone of British defensive positions. More importantly, Japanese tank crews had trained extensively in coordination with infantry assault teams and close support artillery. When a Type 95 tank encountered a British strongpoint, it would immediately call for fire support from 70mm battalion guns that could be moved through the jungle on manpack mounts. The combination of direct fire from tank guns and indirect fire from mortars, coordinated by radio communication between all elements, created a concentration of firepower that British defensive positions could not withstand. The final phase of the Singapore campaign began on February 12, when Lieutenant General Yamashita ordered a general assault on the city's inner defensive perimeter. The Japanese plan called for simultaneous attacks by all three divisions of the 25th Army, supported by every available aircraft of the 3rd Air Division and concentrated fire from artillery units that had been ferried across the Straits of Johor during the previous 48 hours. The Imperial Guards Division, Japan's most elite infantry formation, was assigned to capture the city center and government house, the symbolic heart of British colonial administration in Southeast Asia. The 5th Division would secure the eastern approaches to the city and capture Changi Airfield, the last operational RAF base on the island. The 18th Division would eliminate remaining pockets of resistance in the western suburbs and secure the Keppel Harbor area to prevent any evacuation by sea. MacLeod's position at Alexandra Hospital placed him directly in the path of the Imperial Guards Division's main axis of advance. From his observation post in the hospital's water tower, he could see Japanese infantry companies moving through the suburban streets with the confidence of troops who knew that victory was within their grasp. The rising sun flags that marked the advance of each battalion created a red tide spreading across Singapore Island from the northwest toward the city center. The Japanese assault on February 12 began with a bombardment from 150mm howitzers that had been positioned on the captured high ground around Bukit Timah, Singapore's highest point. The heavy artillery fire was directed not at military targets, but at the civilian areas of the city where refugees from the Malayan Peninsula had created massive camps of displaced persons. The psychological warfare aspect of this bombardment was deliberately calculated. By creating panic among the civilian population, the Japanese forced British commanders to divert troops from defensive positions to maintain order in the rear areas. The 1st Japanese infantry to reach MacLeod's defensive sector belonged to the 4th Guards Regiment, an elite unit that had fought in the Second Sino-Japanese War and possessed extensive experience in urban warfare. Their approach to the Alexandra Hospital area demonstrated the tactical sophistication that had characterized Japanese operations throughout the Malayan campaign. Instead of launching frontal attacks against prepared positions, the Guards Regiment infiltrated through the surrounding residential neighborhoods, using monsoon drains and garden walls to approach the hospital compound from multiple directions simultaneously. MacLeod's Gordon Highlanders detected the Japanese presence at 1,400 hours when a sentry spotted movement in the servants' quarters of a colonial bungalow 300 yards from the hospital's main entrance. The Japanese had been observing the British defensive positions for over an hour, plotting fields of fire and identifying weak points in the perimeter defenses. When the attack began, it came from 6 different directions with the coordinated precision of a military exercise. The weapons that the Japanese infantry carried into combat reflected their emphasis on firepower and mobility. Each squad was equipped with a Type 96 light machine gun that fired 65mm ammunition from a top-mounted magazine, providing sustained automatic fire while remaining light enough for rapid movement through dense terrain. The Type 89 grenade launcher, nicknamed the knee mortar by Allied troops, could place 50mm high-explosive rounds with remarkable accuracy at ranges up to 700 yards. But the most effective Japanese weapon was their tactical doctrine, which emphasized speed, surprise, and the concentration of overwhelming force at the decisive point. When the Guards Regiment attacked the Alexandra Hospital, they committed their entire strength to the assault rather than holding reserves for exploitation. The result was a human wave attack that overran British defensive positions through sheer momentum and firepower density. The close-quarters fighting that erupted around the Alexandra Hospital at 1,430 hours on February 12 represented the kind of combat that British military training had never adequately addressed. The Gordon Highlanders had prepared for warfare on European battlefields where artillery support and air cover would be available to break up enemy concentrations before they could reach bayonet range. In the gardens and corridors of the hospital complex, they found themselves fighting room-to-room combat against Japanese infantry armed with Type 30 bayonets and Type 97 hand grenades. MacLeod's most vivid memory of the battle was the sound of Japanese infantry advancing through the hospital wards. The rhythmic chanting of "Banzai, Tenno Hika Banzai," echoing through corridors filled with wounded men who could not be evacuated. The Geneva Convention required that medical facilities be treated as neutral ground, but the Imperial Japanese Army had demonstrated throughout their campaigns in China that international law was subordinate to military necessity. The massacre that followed the Japanese capture of Alexandra Hospital exemplified the brutal efficiency that had characterized the 25th Army's advance through Malaya. Japanese infantry systematically executed wounded British and Australian soldiers who could not walk, along with the medical staff who attempted to protect them. The Red Cross symbols that marked the building as a protected facility under international law were ignored as Japanese troops searched each ward for weapons and military equipment. By 1700 hours on February 12, the Alexandra Hospital was under complete Japanese control, and MacLeod's surviving Highlanders had withdrawn to secondary positions around the Tengah barracks. The speed of the Japanese advance had exceeded even Yamashita's most optimistic projections. Resistance was collapsing throughout the island as British commanders lost contact with their subordinate units, and the carefully coordinated defensive plan disintegrated into isolated pockets of uncoordinated resistance. The water supply crisis that began on February 13 delivered the decisive blow to Singapore's ability to continue resistance. Japanese artillery fire had severed the main pipeline from the reservoirs in the center of the island, and the pumping stations that supplied water to the city were under direct fire from Japanese positions on the captured high ground. General Percival faced the choice between surrender and watching the civilian population die of thirst while his remaining troops fought without water in the tropical heat. The final Japanese assault on February 14 was preceded by the most intensive air bombardment of the campaign. Every available aircraft of the 3rd Air Division, Mitsubishi Ki-21 Sally bombers, Kawasaki Ki-48 Lily light bombers, and Nakajima Ki-27 Nate fighters, conducted continuous strikes against the remaining British strongpoints around the city center. The psychological impact of unopposed air attack broke the morale of troops who had been fighting without rest for 6 weeks. MacLeod's last clear memory before the surrender was the sight of Japanese infantry advancing down Orchard Road in perfect formation, their rifles at the shoulder and their officers mounted on captured British motorcycles. The rising sun flags that marked their advance fluttered in the humid air like blood-red flowers blooming in the wreckage of the British Empire's confidence in its own invincibility. The formal surrender ceremony took place at 1930 hours on February 15, 1942, in the conference room of the Ford Motor Company factory on Bukit Timah Road. General Arthur Percival, accompanied by his senior staff officers, walked through the Japanese lines carrying a white flag and a Union Jack to signify the end of organized resistance. Lieutenant General Yamashita received the surrender with the courtesy due to a defeated enemy, but his terms were unconditional. All British, Australian, and Indian forces would lay down their arms immediately and report to designated assembly areas for processing as prisoners of war. The strategic consequences of Singapore's fall were felt immediately throughout the British Empire and the Allied coalition. The fortress that Churchill had proclaimed invulnerable had fallen in 8 days to an enemy force that was outnumbered and operating at the end of extended supply lines. The myth of Western military superiority that had sustained European colonial rule throughout Asia was shattered irreparably. The Japanese 25th Army had demonstrated that modern warfare was not about the static defensive positions and artillery duels that had dominated World War I, but about mobility, air power, and the intelligent use of combined arms tactics. More than 85,000 British, Australian, and Indian troops marched into captivity on February 16, 1942, the largest surrender in British military history. Many would die in Japanese prisoner-of-war camps or on forced labor projects like the Burma-Thailand Railway. But the immediate impact was strategic rather than human. The loss of Singapore opened the entire Indian Ocean to Japanese naval forces and threatened the lifeline between Britain and the Middle East that sustained the war effort against Germany and Italy. MacLeod spent the next 3.5 years in Changi Prison, a converted military barracks that became one of the most notorious Japanese prisoner-of-war camps in Southeast Asia. The conditions were deliberately harsh: inadequate food, no medical care, brutal punishment for minor infractions of camp rules. But the psychological impact of defeat was more devastating than physical hardship. The men who had surrendered at Singapore carried the knowledge that they had participated in the most humiliating defeat in British military history. The Japanese occupation of Singapore lasted from February 1942 until September 1945, when British forces returned to reclaim the island following Japan's surrender. During those 3.5 years, the city that had been the crown jewel of British colonial administration in Southeast Asia was renamed into Light of the South Island, and became the administrative center for Japanese control of the Dutch East Indies, British Malaya, and the southern approaches to the South China Sea. But the strategic damage had been done in those 8 days of February 1942 when the Gibraltar of the East fell to an enemy that British planners had consistently underestimated. The Japanese 25th Army's conquest of Singapore demonstrated that modern warfare favored speed, mobility, and tactical innovation over static defense and numerical superiority. The lessons learned in the jungles and rubber plantations of Malaya would be applied throughout the Pacific War as Allied forces adapted their tactics to match Japanese standards of military effectiveness. The sight of the rising sun flag flying over Government House on February 15, 1942, marked the end of an era in military history. The age of fortress warfare and colonial confidence had ended, replaced by a new form of conflict where air power, armored mobility, and superior leadership could overcome any fixed defensive position. The 85,000 Allied troops who marched into captivity at Singapore carried with them the knowledge that they had witnessed the birth of modern combined arms warfare in the Pacific theater. MacLeod's memories of those 8 days would remain vivid for the rest of his life. The sound of Japanese artillery fire echoing across the Straits of Johor, the sight of Type 95 tanks advancing through the rubber plantations, the smell of cordite and burning fuel oil that filled the humid air of Singapore Island. But the image that haunted him most was that rising sun flag flying over the city that had been considered impregnable, a symbol of how quickly military confidence could be shattered by an enemy who understood that warfare had evolved beyond the static defensive concepts that had dominated military thinking since 1918. The fall of Singapore changed the course of World War II in the Pacific by demonstrating that Japanese military capabilities far exceeded Western estimates. The tactical innovations that Yamashita's forces employed, infiltration tactics, combined arms coordination, and the integration of air power with ground operations, would become standard throughout the Pacific War. But the strategic lesson was even more significant. In modern warfare, defensive positions were only as strong as the mobility and morale of the troops who held them. The Gordon Highlanders who survived the battle and the subsequent imprisonment would carry those lessons back to British military units that fought in Burma, Italy, and Northwest Europe. The tactical concepts that the Japanese had demonstrated in Malaya the use of light tanks in difficult terrain, the coordination of air and ground forces, the emphasis on speed and surprise over firepower and fortification, were gradually incorporated into Allied military doctrine as the war progressed. But for MacLeod and the men who had witnessed the rising sun flag flying over Singapore's government house, the most important lesson was personal rather than tactical. They had learned that military confidence based on racial prejudice and historical precedent was worthless against an enemy who possessed superior training, equipment, and leadership. The Japanese 25th Army had won the Singapore campaign not through numerical superiority or technological advantage, but through better understanding of how modern warfare should be conducted. The strategic consequences of Singapore's fall rippled throughout the war in the Pacific and beyond. The Japanese conquest of the Dutch East Indies, which followed immediately after Singapore's surrender, gave them control of the oil resources that their war machine required. The threat to India and Australia forced the Allies to divert resources from other theaters, delaying offensive operations in Europe and the Mediterranean. Most importantly, the demonstration of Japanese military effectiveness convinced neutral powers throughout Asia that the European colonial era was ending and that accommodation with Japan might be more prudent than resistance. The recovery of Singapore in September 1945 by Admiral Lord Louis Mountbatten's Southeast Asia Command was accomplished with minimal resistance, as Japanese forces in Malaya were isolated and demoralized by their string of defeats in the Central Pacific. But the city that British forces reclaimed bore little resemblance to the confident colonial stronghold that had fallen 3.5 years earlier. The myth of Western military invincibility had been permanently shattered, and the political foundations of European colonial rule in Asia had been undermined beyond repair. MacLeod returned to Scotland in late 1945, one of the survivors of an experience that had changed his understanding of warfare and empire. The Gordon Highlanders were reconstituted as a regular battalion, but the men who had fought at Singapore carried knowledge that set them apart from soldiers who had served in other theaters. They had witnessed the birth of modern Pacific warfare and understood how quickly military superiority could shift when one side possessed better tactics, training, and leadership than their opponents. The tactical lessons of the Singapore campaign were systematically studied by Allied military planners throughout the remainder of the Pacific War. The Japanese emphasis on mobility and infiltration influenced American operations in the Central Pacific, where island-hopping campaigns bypassed strong Japanese defensive positions in favor of rapid advances that isolated enemy garrisons. The coordination of air and ground forces that had been so effective in Malaya became standard procedure for Allied operations from Guadalcanal to Okinawa. But the strategic lesson of Singapore was simpler and more profound. In modern warfare, the side that adapts most quickly to changing conditions will prevail regardless of initial advantages in manpower or fortification. The Japanese 25th Army had conquered Singapore in 8 days not because they possessed superior numbers or equipment, but because they understood that 20th century warfare required speed, flexibility, and the intelligent use of combined arms tactics. The sight of the rising sun flag over Government House represented more than just military defeat. It marked the end of an era when European powers could maintain control over Asian populations through military superiority based on 19th century concepts of warfare. The Japanese had demonstrated that Asian military forces, properly trained and equipped, could defeat Western armies using tactics that Western military academies had not yet learned to counter. MacLeod's final memory of Singapore before his capture was the silence that settled over the city on the evening of February 15, 1942. The artillery fire that had echoed across the island for 8 days had ceased, and the only sound was the distant noise of Japanese vehicles moving through the streets. The British Empire's most important naval base in Southeast Asia had fallen to an enemy that most British officers had dismissed as racially inferior and tactically primitive. The prisoners who marched into Changi Prison on February 16 carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in one of the most significant defeats in military history. But they also carried the understanding that warfare had evolved beyond the static concepts that had dominated military thinking since the trenches of World War I. The lessons learned in the jungles of Malaya would eventually contribute to Allied victory in the Pacific, but only after the cost of those lessons had been paid in the blood and suffering of men who had trusted in fortifications that proved inadequate against superior tactics and training. The rising sun flag that MacLeod saw flying over Singapore's Government House on February 15, 1942, marked the beginning of a new phase in military history. The age of fortress warfare was ending, and the era of mobile, combined arms operations was beginning. The Japanese 25th Army had written the first chapter of that new era with their conquest of the Gibraltar of the East in 8 days that changed the course of World War II and the future of warfare itself. When I saw the rising sun flag over Singapore's government house, I understood that I had witnessed the end of one era and the beginning of another. The fortress that had been considered impregnable had fallen to an enemy who understood that modern warfare required speed, surprise, and superior tactics rather than static defense and numerical superiority. The lessons of those 8 days in February 1942 would shape military thinking for decades to come, but the price of that education was the collapse of confidence that had sustained the British Empire for 2 centuries. The tactical innovations that enabled the Japanese conquest of Singapore, infiltration tactics, combined arms coordination, and the integration of air power with ground operations, would become standard practice throughout the Pacific War. But the strategic lesson was even more significant. In the modern era, military superiority belonged to the side that could adapt most quickly to changing conditions and apply new concepts of warfare most effectively. The sight of that rising sun flag flying over the heart of British colonial power in Southeast Asia was burned into the memory of every man who witnessed it. It represented not just military defeat, but the recognition that the world had changed irrevocably and that the assumptions that had guided Western military thinking for generations were no longer valid in the face of enemies who had mastered the art of modern warfare. The fall of Singapore in 8 days demonstrated that fortress mentality and racial prejudice were no match for superior training, innovative tactics, and the will to victory. The Japanese 25th Army had achieved what many military experts had considered impossible, and in doing so had written a new chapter in the history of warfare that would influence military thinking long after the last shot of World War II had been fired. The prisoners who marched into captivity on February 16, 1942, carried with them not just the burden of defeat, but the knowledge that they had witnessed one of the defining moments of modern military history. The rising sun flag over Government House marked the end of the colonial era and the beginning of a new age in which military effectiveness would be determined by adaptability, innovation, and understanding of how 20th century warfare should be conducted. That flag would fly over Singapore for 3.5 years, but its real significance lay in what it represented. The proof that in modern warfare, there are no impregnable fortresses, only soldiers who understand how to use speed, surprise, and superior tactics to overcome any defensive position. The lesson of Singapore would be remembered as long as soldiers studied the art of war, a testament to the power of military innovation over military tradition.